Yeah, so, we're aware of the predictions, and we're starting to see, of course, those impacts in the type of fires we had in the Black Summers. But one of the other things that is changing quite rapidly is the expertise and the research. And there's just an extraordinary amount of work being done by universities, researchers and CSIRO and others, gathering information that a decade or so ago we just didn't have. So what we knew 5 years ago, in my view, is not adequate because there is so much new stuff to prepare us better. So I heard at a recent bushfire conference, the head researcher from CSIRO say that the policies that we currently work under in every jurisdiction in Australia are at least 10 years behind research. So there's a great opportunity and a challenge for us to update, to catch up with what experience and research is showing us. So yeah, we just have the ability to do much better, but the challenges are probably as great now as they've ever been.
Okay, thanks, Rod. Before we go to Amanda, I should also just tell you all that the media have been invited along today, and this meeting's being recorded. So just so that you're aware of that, that someone may be taking your words down for posterity. Amanda, could you give us a quick chat on your perspective?
Thanks, Annette. And I just want to start by acknowledging country as well. I want to acknowledge that this country that we live on was and will always be Aboriginal land. And I want to pay my respects to the elders. And, the elders today have got such wonderful knowledge that they can share with us. And I've seen firsthand how, a cool burn, for instance, and using cool burn strategies has an impact on the bush, on how it impacts on the bush. And I was fortunate enough when I had my little place out at Brooman that, I got to hang on the end of a piece of black poly that was on fire, walk around the boundary of the place and, with that dripping black poly, make sure that our place was safe from, safe as you can get from fire, being prepared with a cool understory burn. And it was one of the most interesting sort of, experiences of my life, being a woman who, grew up in Northern Ireland where bushfire was nothing that we ever dealt with or heard of. It was more floods. Being able to experience that firsthand was tremendous. The other thing that I want to talk about is, that experience, the Black Summer Fire. And, I'm not going to go into depth in that, but what I experienced through that was I saw firsthand the incredible efforts of the people in and around the Shoalhaven, the people that came from far and wide. And I really want to thank all of those people who fought those fires with gusto, who didn't sleep, who turned up every day and, basically just put their whole lives on the line and their whole lives on hold to try and protect, what they could. And because of all of those protections, over 1,800 homes were saved here in the Shoalhaven through that. I also got to see on the back end, through the Emergency Operations Centre, how things come together from that perspective. I got to talk to the mappers, I got to talk to the guys in parks, I got to talk to all of those that were part of that whole big operation and get a really sort of firm understanding about what was going on. But what I really took away from that was, how can we educate and help our community work better when these times are upon us? Because I guess that's the responsibility. To me, that's our responsibility in government, whether it's through, our connections and our relationships with RFS or with other firefighting organisations. If we come together as a community and we work hard to plan for the very worst outcome, when the very worst hits us, then we will be in better shape to deal with it. And then we will be in better shape to bounce back from it. And, it was within weeks of the fire passing through Kangaroo Valley that I got to talk to a great fellow called Mike Gorman. I'm sure that there'll be a few guys on the screen who will go, yep, I know who Mike is. And Mike explained to me one of the programs that they did in the Valley was about going out to people and talking to them about their fire preparation plans. Because, I'll put my hand up as a blocky, you know, it was like, do you have a fire plan? Oh yeah, I've got a fire plan. Was it written down? No. And if things went really pear-shaped, would I have been able to, you know, do something sensible? Probably not. So Mike Gorman really drove home to me the fact that, you know, fire plans are so necessary, but not just for the one property, but for groups of properties who can work together. And if you're in, and I'm going to look at Peter Winkler, you know, he's in a pretty fire-prone place in the Naringala Valley there out near Manyana. And if those neighbours can all come together as they have in the past and as they did in 2019, 2020, then the outcomes for them are far better. And part of that process of going through the fire planning and making sure that your fire plan actually will work also gives you that mindset that when you do leave your place, and if you return to your place and your place is no longer there, that you went through a decision-making process beforehand, and that decision-making process beforehand empowered you to know that your ability to fight that fire was probably going to be very slim and that you would be able to leave. So that, you know, leaving was the best choice for you. So it was having that chat with Mike that really made me think that, you know, for us as Shoalhaven Greens, in the 10th highest place in Australia, I'm just going to say that again, number 10, the highest place in Australia that is bushfire prone, that one of the best services that we could give to our people is to walk them through a program that is, you know, that Mike Gorman outlined to me. And the way that we can do that is with those, I'm going to call them the bushfire rangers or something like that. And they can go out, work with RFS, work with our people and try and create those plans that will then create better outcomes for our people into the future. I'll stop there, Annette, because I could go on.
Thanks very much, Amanda. Just a reminder to all of you, if you'd like to get me involved in the discussion or ask a question, please hit that raise your hand button under reactions down the bottom. You'll pop up on my screen and I'll know that you're waiting to ask a question. But I guess from my perspective, I know a lot of people I talk to are still really anxious about the possibility of fires this year. I guess, Rod, I'd like to ask you first of all, should we be worried? And maybe then Amanda can offer some thoughts as well.
I look, every summer in this part of the world brings the potential for a bushfire. And, you know, will we see the amount of the landscape burning that we saw in 2019-20? No, but do we have the potential to have fires of similar intensity in isolated places? And the answer is yes. So it all depends on the seasonal dryness, and it's not too bad just at the moment. But in years gone by, the dryness can rapidly deteriorate, like in 1994 when we had emergency fires then. That was really just a week of really dry weather, and then we had emergency level fires occurring. So there is fuel that was unburnt from a couple of years ago. I've gone out and done property inspections in recent times, and it's really surprising just how rapidly some of the regrowth has occurred, and particularly wattle regrowth. So in some places in Kangaroo Valley, I saw some really dense mid-story fuel, and that tends to be the more problematic fuel. It's elevated fire. Once it gets in, it's got wind and oxygen around it, so it can carry fires into the treetops. So even areas that were burnt a couple of years ago, you can't dismiss totally. So yeah, every time the bushfire season comes, we need to be prepared in the Shoalhaven.
Amanda, are you picking up on that anxiety amongst people?
Yes, definitely. And, you know, that anxiety that, you know, because we haven't really recovered as yet from 2019, 2020, and we've had all of those barriers in the way to having like a full and I suppose a wholesome recovery. You know, there's a lot of nervousness in our community. And, you know, it was only, a few weeks ago that there was a fire up north around Mundamaya. And, you know, as soon as that smoke came in the air, I know that a lot of people were very, very agitated, and it brought back horrendous memories from 2019, 2020. and I think that's, you know, that's absolutely something that we should feel, because part of those feelings of that nervousness is then the thing that drives us to be better prepared. And, you know, one of the wise old heads in the RFS, you know, was saying, you know, clear a metre away from your house. When you've cleared that metre, go and clear another metre. When you've cleared that metre, go clear another metre, and just keep on pushing that, you know, pushing that clearing out and away from your home, I think was, you know, some of the best advice that I've ever heard. And so, you know, getting our people into that mindset that getting ready is an important thing to do. You know, cleaning out our gutters, raking up our leaves, moving our fuel away, particularly in the summer. You know, how many people stack up a little pile of firewood near their back door because it's so easy to go and get it in winter? Well, you know, come September, get rid of that stuff, get it down the back, and you can drag it back up in you know, the cold months again.
Peter Winkler, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, hello. I live in the Niringala Valley, and it's very fire prone and was hit really hard. But one of the things that was particularly useful was about 3 years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, Kelwyn White from the Bateman's Bay RFS came out to our property. And she, you know, she really knew her stuff. She took a lot of photos. She must have taken 50 photos around the place, and then came back with a report to us about how to better prepare our place in case of fire. I won't go into the detail, but it included things like, this tree is very fire prone, too close to the house. These trees are not very fire prone, and they're quite good near the house for shade or whatever. She also, obviously, as Amanda was saying, talked about gutters and gutter guards, and in particular raking. So before the fire hit us on New Year's Eve, we spent about 5 days doing everything, going through the list that she provided us. And the reason I'm going into this detail is that I've spoken to Kelwyn since then, and she's thrilled with the idea that Shoalhaven Council will appoint 3 additional fire officers, 1 for each ward, that she can work through in terms of creating that kind of opportunity for people, particularly in fire-prone areas, and so much of us are. So maybe Amanda could go through that, as that's one of our main policy platforms, of appointing these 3 additional fire officers, 1 for each ward.
Yes, Amanda, I'm a bit curious about that as well. What will they do? Will they actually come to my house and tell me what I should be doing?
Absolutely, Annette. That's the whole intention of this as a program, you know. And why the number 3? Well, it's the north, south, and the central, and starting at those places that are really close to the most dense bush. So those that are most at risk, you know, taking that approach where, you know, they will turn up, just as Kelwyn did, Peter, to those groups of properties, sit down with those groups of owners, and, you know, and talking to Mike Gorman about how this worked. He said that, you know, any more than 10 properties in a group, and there started to be not as much accountability to each neighbour within that grouping, because then that, you know, we go back to that, oh yeah, have you got a fire plan? Yeah, I have, you know. But and how that would be working was, you know, going through not just the plan, but then asking people what they were prepared to do, and where was their final plan when they were going to be, you know, when a fire was bearing down on them. And, you know, having one of those human resources available, north, south, and central, I think is really important.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question via the chat thing, so we'll just get to that, and then I'll come to you, Caroline. It's, how do we convince decision makers to follow the science and the recommendations of the Royal Commission? And I think this is from Jo. She'd like to know the view of the firefighters online about adopting best practice at a local level. So I guess the political question, that's probably one for you, Amanda.
I keep moving my cursor off my mute button, so I've got the Zoom disease of you're on mute. I don't know why it is so difficult to convince those that are in power to do the right thing for the people. When we've had over, what's the number? Over 90 commissions of inquiry over the last 100 years. And every time those commissions of inquiry have gone through, there's been, recommendations that have made, and some things happen and some things don't. And if we had have actually capitalised on those inquiries as we've gone along, when we got to this bunch of inquiries, the recommendation list would have been far, far smaller. So I don't know if it's about, resourcing and money. If that's the only thing that's blocking people, then maybe it's about time we had to think about how in this country we start to resource natural disaster a bit better. If you cast your mind back to Cyclone Yasi, and it was the first time that the nation had ever paid a natural disaster levy. And perhaps that's something that the Commonwealth should be thinking about, because we absolutely know, because there's been so little action on climate change here and globally, that things will intensify as we move through the years to come. And maybe it's time that the federal government acknowledge that, put some form of levy in place so that we do have the cash to buy in the resources that we need.
Thanks, Amanda. With a second part to that, but Caroline, you have a question at the moment.
Yeah, just wondering if Rod and Amanda might have a comment about also what can be done both at the community level or at government level to better protect our kind of wild areas, bush, animals, habitats and ecosystems.
Rod, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, sure. Look, I like to view bushfire risk in a couple of different spheres. There's certainly the landscape level bushfire risk, and that's where the plants and animals are largely. And then there's life and property, and the fuel that contributes most to the attack on buildings and on people is within 100 metres or so of buildings. So what happens further out is less significant, but nevertheless important. And good planning, in my view, recognises that parts of the landscape contribute significantly to attack on buildings and on people, and other parts of the landscape may be treated in a manner that mitigates the fire spread across the landscape, creates opportunities for firefighters to take advantage of cooler conditions or a recent hazard reduction burn. So when you piece together the landscape puzzle, and there's all sorts of really good science around to measure and to map the highest risk localities, fire pathways, where there are threatened species, where there are vulnerable communities, where there are sensitive catchments. And you can place all of that information into databases, into mapping systems, overlay them, and come up with strategies across the landscape that can better protect flora and fauna, and certainly maintain biodiversity. But part of the challenge is recognising that life and property protection occurs at the interface, not 10 kilometres out. 10 kilometres out may reduce the number of fires that come through, but there's all sorts of research that validates that prescribed burning does not stop fires. So it's using prescribed burning in the landscape in a manner that's appropriate for your objectives. So the closer you're in, then it's more life and property protection. The further you're out, then there are other opportunities.
Thanks, Rod. Amanda, did you have a quick thought on that? We have some more questions building up, so if we can keep the answers fairly brief, but yeah.
I'd really like to hear from, if they're willing to give us some of their opinions on that. Greg Tedder and Luke Bastock have got enormous, experience in this space. It'd be really great to hear from them, and how, Carolyn, how they've done their work in the past and to protect threatened species within the landscape.
Guys?
Greg.
I actually can't find my raise the hand button. Just want to support what Rod's saying. I think there in the last 15, 20 years or something, our emphasis has been on total number of hectares that have been hazard reduced. There's a tendency to go out and get big areas. In many cases, a lot of that burning, and Luke will probably attest to this too, a lot of that burning, it's not complete burning. It's basically we treat an area. And the emphasis has been on hectares rather than on the risk or the threat. And I think that we need to change the focus of this. I think we're spending enormous amounts of time and money with the false hope that by burning large areas out in the wilderness area that we're actually achieving anything. I think the focus really should be, as Rod said, within 100 metres of the asset. And I think Ross Bradstock said something like 99% of the damage done by fires is caused by less than 1% of the fires. It really shows that the catastrophic events are difficult to manage, and they're the ones that cause us the most grief. And I don't think that broadacre burning necessarily achieves that. I mean, there are certain advantages about it. I think it's important that we continue to introduce fire to the natural landscape, but I would do it in a way that Aboriginal people do it, and that is in a way that's patchy burning, and it's more about the health of the environment there rather than risk mitigation. So, yeah, I think that's, I hope that's useful.
It is. Thank you very much. We've got a very quick question that I'm sure Amanda can give an answer to from Andrew, who says that Bendalong is having a community pre-fire cleanup in a few weeks. And can they get someone from council to advise them on what they ought to be doing as a priority?
So Andrew, at this point, we could probably get you council's bushfire mitigation officer to come along and be part of that planning day. The bushfire mitigation officer's role so far has been to, go to where council managed reserves, which is less than 1% of the landscape. So where the council reserves butt up against suburbia or the urban interface, is that, that's what they've been doing, is, making sure that they're there to help communities who say, oh, that park or that natural space, we think it should be burnt, and they turn up and they do that assessment. So yeah, it'd be worthwhile dropping me an email, and I'll just see if I can get the mitigation officer to attend.
Now, Kay had her hand up. Kay, are you still there?
Yeah, I am still there. Thank you so much. And Mike, I was just listening to the Greg and Rod talking about, where we burn and where we don't burn, and remembering the pyrocumulus storms and the impact they had on the neighbourhood. We had 2 here in Vincentia, which was nowhere near any fires in 2019-20. So and I know that they're increasing, and I wonder how do they occur, and would that sort of patchwork burning that you talk about reduce the frequency of the pyrocumulus storms, because they're terrifying?
Rod, that sounds like a technical
question.
question.
Yeah, look, it's a technical question, a technical answer, but I'll try to simplify. Look, there's some good science that University of New South Wales have provided that enable us to identify before fires occur what landscapes are going to contribute to volatile fire behaviour. And this is fire behaviour beyond what the normal formulas say. And some of those will result in pyrocumulus clouds, but they result in similar, really adverse, crazy fire weather conditions. So we can capture some of those, and they tend to be slopes greater than 18 degrees, fuel loads greater than 25 tonnes per hectare, if you're familiar with that sort of term. And there needs to be wind conditions and fuel dryness. So when all of those things line up, if a fire travels across that bit of landscape, then you're going to get crazy fire behaviour and spotting and potentially pyrocumulus clouds. Other places where it occurs, like over Mount Scansey in the 1920 fires, that's partly a result of very dry conditions, steep slopes, the wind behind it, pushing the fire up the slopes. But it is, so in general terms, you can pretty much get pyrocumulus clouds in any extreme fire behaviour. And that's usually related to the fuel load, the dryness, and the weather conditions at the time. So if all of those things line up, then yeah, they can unfortunately be produced in a lot of our landscape. But we can predict the places where it's most likely, or we're starting to get to where we can predict it's most likely. And this is one of those new trends I was talking about. We will start to identify those as priority areas to mitigate the risks. But it is one of the fire behaviours that we're going to have to find operational solutions to. And there's a lot of research. The Bureau of Meteorology are doing a lot of work on predicting when it's likely to occur in a summer, in a bushfire. So yeah, there's a way to go, but there are things being looked at.
Okay, thanks for that.
Terry, you have your hand up. Terry, back?
Yes, sorry. Yep. Thanks very much. I'm not quite sure who would want to answer this one, but I'd like to draw attention to one of those communities that was under threat from the pyrocumulus event that was threatened to come across the Shoalhaven River. Unfortunately, a change in wind from our point of view directed in another direction. Not so good for the people who copped it. You mentioned Budgong, I think, or Mount Scansey. The fire bounced over Budgong, Kangaroo Valley, Bungonia in February 2020. But it was threatening to bounce over across to the North Narra Bomaderry area. And boy, there would have been a lot of people have their butts burnt to buggery if that had happened. So we were very fortunate in that sense. So here we are left with an area that did not burn. I'm just having a bit of trouble in getting access here, but did not burn. I'll get it in a minute. But anyway, an area that did not burn in that fire, but is now, if we get a bad season again, drought conditions will be very much under threat because we've got so much unburnt bushland and a lot of housing and growing housing that's going to affect the, is going to increase the population in this area. And I'm just wondering whether there's any thought being given to, does anyone know about that, any thought being given to areas like this that are under threat because they didn't get burnt in the last fire season or the previous, the 1920 fire season?
Greg, you had your hand up. Is that to respond to that question or?
Bleakly. I just think the reality is that we've left the elephant out at the moment. We may as well bring it in with climate change. I think the reality is that we will get more of these catastrophic events. The idea that hazard reduction in general is going to reduce the impact of those catastrophic events, I question. I don't believe that's the case. I think that we need to think about what we can do around our houses, around our assets and around our towns and in the immediate area, than think that we are able to prevent these catastrophic events happening. Hazard reduction burning is effective for the first couple of years, and then it's effective if it starts to drop away very sharply. In a catastrophic event, even areas which have been fuel reduced the year before are likely to carry fire through them. And I think that there's some kind of magic wand we can wave over the landscape to say that we're actually going to prevent these is just not a reality. So the emphasis has got to be, as I said, around the assets. I think that is the best plan. We need to do stuff out there in the wilderness areas, the large landscapes. But Terry, I think that just because there's bush around you doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to result in a catastrophic event. As Rod has said, these events occur when all the factors of fire, driving a fire, aligned to their maximum slope, wind, dryness, soil moisture, structure of the fuel, all those kind of things contribute to the catastrophic event. I think the best thing to do is to focus around the assets.
Could I just comment that in that regard, I think that's very relevant. I wasn't seeking that we get in and burn off around these areas necessarily, because some of these bushland areas have got threatened species in them. Some species that probably don't require fire to any great degree. Other species that do require more fire. In one area I've got in mind is a threatened orchid, and it's quite close to urban areas in bushland that hasn't burnt for 20 plus years. Now, I don't think this is the sort of vegetation that can be left like that. It needs some level of management, and it might need some more focused, low intensity type burning, and maybe other approaches too. But there's a real threat to the community, and there's a threat to that particular species of not having fire. And so maybe ideas come in both together. I'm not suggesting that we've got to go in with a knowledge of the risks to the community, it seems to me, and with a knowledge of the biodiversity of these areas.
Thanks, Terry. Amanda, looking at the New South Wales Greens bushfire policy, there is a lot of talk about strategic burning. I'm wondering whether you or Evan would like to talk a little bit more about that and how it would work, because it sounds very relevant to what Terry's talking about.
I've done a lot of talking, Annette. I'm going to pass that stick over to Evan, but I'm going to say hi to Casey as well, because I've just seen your face come in on the screen, Casey. So we've got another expert in the room as well. So we might have to call on you for some answers as well, Casey.
Yeah, no worries.
Put the hand up again.
Yeah, well, there's so many people that are so much more experienced and have so much more knowledge than I do in this meeting. I did a lot of work in the 1920 and I appreciate how devastating they are. How it seemed they just went from one moment being controllable to the next moment a weather change and all sorts of things happening. So I really bow to the knowledge of people like Rod and Casey and others, and it seems totally logical to me that we need to plan better, and those plans that Rod is talking about, that I guess could lead us to know where to do strategic burning and move away from a hectares basis to a risk basis that Greg was mentioning, and really looking at protecting property and lives in a very, very strategic way. So look, I don't want to say any more. Thanks very much.
Okay, Peter Winkler has his hand up, and then we'll come to you, David Rush.
Yeah, I wanted to say that, of course, we're focusing a great deal on fire preparedness or fire prevention, and I guess we'll come back to that. But the other aspect of all this, having been in a community that was cut off after catastrophic fire, is the initiatives that council have made and will continue to make to build resilience into communities that are likely to face this again. I'm talking about Manyana now, because that's my nearest village. And Manyana was cut off for a fortnight, virtually, without power, without mobile phones and all that. So I know that Amanda's been really proactive about creating the kinds of resilience in places like the Manyana Hall. And I'm not sure that everyone's aware of that and how much more of that is happening with regard to power, solar power, with regard to all the other things that will help people if they are cut off by fire in the future, because we're pretty sure it's going to happen again. Not this year, but it will happen again. So maybe, Amanda, you could explain a little bit about that's been happening so far.
Yeah, I'll happily talk about that resilience project, Peter. But I just want to ask our RFS people in the room, do you know if the Hotspots Fire Project is still current in New South Wales? Because I can remember, probably 15 years ago, there was a group of people came together out at Brooman, and they were guided through that project by the RFS and by others as well. And that was absolutely about the strategic burning and, understanding that if we burnt too much in one area, that it would create worsening fuel loads by, too much black wattle coming through. yeah, that the hotspots program was really great, but I haven't heard of it for a really, really long time. So while you guys think about that, I'll just talk quickly about the resilience project. And coming out of the fires, you know, what was really, really obvious was that when people were stranded in our one road in, one road out villages, that communications and power really became an issue. And so driving that project, we've had 23 sites identified across the Shoalhaven that will be fitted out with satellite phone, batteries, solar panels, and that satellite phone will go to a screen. It's not a television screen, it's think CNN and news kind of screen. Maybe even think of like one of those menu screens. Anyway, the idea is to connect that to better sources of information so that people who do get stuck in those one road in, one road out villages have got a place to go to where they can share a little bit of power up their phone, but know that they've got a satellite phone to the outside world, and know that they'll be able to connect in and talk to services about the issues that are at hand. So, you know, it's not a be all and end all, but it's about trying to create some form of connection when there wasn't one the last time.
Okay, David Rush, you've had your hand up for a while, and I understand that you'd like to talk about hotspots as well.
Hi, thanks, Annette. Hello, everyone, and thanks for putting on this forum. Such a great idea. Just wanted to make a couple of comments. One was about bushfire preparedness, and I think many people know that this is something that's advocated by the RFS every year as an annual practice, regardless of what sort of season we might experience. So, that's something that they're pushing all the time. Several years ago, quite a few years ago now, I worked for both the RFS, and then I did assessments for council, both for DAs, subdivisions, and some other work I did for council as well. And one of the things that I suggested to council at that time was that the weed teams that they use, that generally focus on weeds in the warmer months, could potentially also be trained up and resourced up to do hazard reduction on council managed reserve lands in the cooler months. Something that didn't really get up, and I think that paper probably got shelved somewhere. I'm not even sure if I still have a copy of that, but it was just obviously resourcing is an issue for council in relation to that, and they would need to be trained and resourced. But it was just an idea that that I had, because council, what happens is council relies heavily on RFS volunteers to do hazard reduction in council reserves, but the RFS is pretty busy as it is. I mean, they have to share their time amongst Crown land, hazard reduction, burning, and council land. So, and the volunteers, I think, when I worked for the RFS, one of the things that I struggled with was trying to convince the volunteers that typically would burn an area every couple of years around a village for hazard reduction and safety to life and property. Maybe not realising that they were having some effect on the vegetation suite around that village, potentially making some of them more fire prone for fire-loving species. And, I think when I was working with them, GIS wasn't used as much as certainly what Rod was talking about earlier these days, but, it was hard to convince them to use geographic information systems in the mapping around the villages for protection for life and property, but looking at the environmental aspects around those villages as well. So threatened species, threatened animals, threatened vegetation communities and the like. So anyway, that's just an idea. As far as hotspots fire workshops, yes, they're still a thing. They're still running. In fact, in the work that I'm doing, running a few environmental projects with the New South Wales Environmental Trust funding, we're going to run 2 hotspots workshops, one in the Upper Kangaroo River area and one in the Berry area a bit later this year. And we're getting towards the pointy end of it, but I believe the one in the Upper Kangaroo River will happen in December, and a date to be announced for the Berry one. So yes, they're still happening. NCC and RFS work jointly to run those hotspots workshops, and they look not just at life and property protection, but also at the environmental aspects around the landscape where they run the workshops. Thanks.
Okay, no one's got their hand up, but we haven't come back to the second part of an earlier question, which was getting best practice on a local level. And I'm wondering whether some of our firefighters could talk about how that's best done. We've been asked for Casey's perspective on this, if he's prepared to do that.
Yeah, sure. So locally, there's a lot of, obviously since 1920, the RFS had a massive influx of membership through its books, particularly locally. COVID has obviously played a big problem in terms of preparing those firefighters for on the ground duties. One of the big things overall from the 1920 fires that we saw was once a fire became as big as it did, particularly with Currowan, and became sectorised throughout so many sort of parts and places, that the communication was a little bit of an issue. And I know that the service has definitely improved and worked on that sort of stuff. There's a whole heap of different things that have come into play from Black Summer, as they call it, in terms of training, which will be passed on to our members throughout this year, particularly as we get into this coming fire season. So yeah, it's happening. There is definitely work that's happening from the service in the background to improve our volunteers, I guess.
Thanks, Casey. Evan has his hand up.
Yeah, I thought I'd just like to take this opportunity when we have so many brains in the Zoom to ask the question that the Shoalhaven has so many visitors in the summer, and so we can help residents to get prepared. A lot of properties around the place are rentals, and then we get a lot of visitors coming in, and the visitors are not have even less understanding about bushfires and what to do in the case of a bushfire. So I was thinking we're in an updated Shoalhaven kind of plan and council plan, we need to have some way to connect better, I think, well, understand the implications of all these visitors, and also some ways of communicating with these visitors so that the chaos of last summer, or the last time it happened, we try and avoid that. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one, Evan, because that's absolutely this the $2 million resilience recovery into resilience project that was funded by the state and federal government, that's supplying the solar panels and the satellite phones. The other part of that is about that community preparedness and community readiness. So one of the things that's in preparation right now is like a booklet that will go, it's meant to go into all of these, fun houses that people come down and hang out in over the summer, and into all of those businesses as well, so that people who do come from the city or otherwise turn up in the Shoalhaven, it's got in it the warnings. What do the warnings mean? If you're told to leave early, what does leaving early look like for you? Where are you going to go? And mostly that would be going back home. And that, if you're stuck, what do you do in the point that you are stuck? So that's being worked up with Kim White. Kim White will be a familiar name to many because she's our local emergency management officer, or our LEMO. She's a tremendous resource for the area, and she's working on that right now.
Thank you, Amanda. Greg, you had your hand up.
I feel like I've said too much already. In terms of prep works, I was quite amazed. We went and visited a particular area around Berry just recently. We had a complaint from somebody, but anyway, we went up and had a look, and we visited 9 properties on the escarpment, and I was surprised at how poorly people were prepared, and not only just in terms of the hazards around their place, but also the types of equipment they had. I mean, a number of properties had pumps and they had tank water supplied, but they all had the wrong fittings on them. The pumps looked like they hadn't been run for, I don't know however long, probably since the Currawong fire, perhaps, if they were run then. I'm not quite sure whether it's a function of the fact that some of these people are actually based in Sydney and come down here or not, but really, I think the idea of having people going out and physically visiting people's properties, it's time consuming, but I think it's got enormous value. And I think that that's something that RFS and volunteers need to work on it. As you said, Mike Gorman, I think you said that was doing that. And I think it's a really valuable thing to do. And if these council officers come on board and start doing that kind of stuff, I think it could make a bit of a difference. The other thing I just wanted to say was what I found in the Currawong fire, which is a bit frustrating, is that people think that recovery comes after the event. And I think that there's a lot more work that the agencies need to do, and that's through the Local Emergency Management Committee to start recovery during the actual event. Because the fire is dynamic and it moves, and I think we're not quick enough to get into the community to start recovery exercise. You know, we're engaged in mop up, we're engaged in sort of structural stuff in terms of making sure things are safe. But I think there's a whole social issue and community issue that needs to be addressed really early on during the fire, and not waiting for the fire to be out before we start moving in there. Now, I understand that we probably did do that, but I think we need to do it a lot quicker and with a lot more veracity, if you like. Yeah.
Quick comment, Amanda?
Yeah, no, you're right, Greg. And it's that visibility about getting back in there, you know, because where I'm going to cast my mind back to around about the 5th or the 6th of December, not long after that fire passed through Borley, and we had that, you know, the wreckage up there on Monkey Mountain. And, you know, at that point we were thinking, right, we've got to get our recovery committee together. We thought we were going to be just working on a really small patch of ground with, and that we were going to cross over into the Eurobadalla because there'd been some damage down there. At that point, there were that seems like such a wrong thing to say. There had been 17 homes at that point that were destroyed, and, you know, trying to get in there really quickly to return water, you know, for Shoalhaven Council, Council were right in there trying to get the water back on. I know that the comms guys from council were in there doing that work as well, but it's about that visibility too to the rest of the community, so that people can see that that stuff is happening. You know, because a lot of the time I hear, you know, I do hear lots of criticism about, oh, well, where were you for this, or what did you do for that? And it's like, well, actually that was kind of happening, but you just weren't able to see it. So how do we get that message out there? And I just want to acknowledge too that Mike Gorman is on the line. There's so many people on this Zoom that I've just flicked through one of the pages. Mike, you've probably heard your name now taken in vain a couple of times, but I want to say that you've been the inspiration from that conversation that we had in the Valley, you know, in 2020, for, you know, not just this conversation, but for the policy that the Greens want to bring with putting on these officers to, you know, go out and do that hard slog and to get in to see people and get them to check their pumps and do all that kind of work. So I want to really thank you, and thanks for being here today.
Thanks from all of us, Mike. We're running out of time, but there's room for a couple more questions, and then I might just get some concluding comments from our main speakers. Moo, you're next, and Tonya, you're after that.
Hi, thanks for that. Yeah, I have a lot of comments about the recovery, but I'm not going to go into them now. My question is about the rental properties, the Airbnbs, and their preparedness. Is the onus on the property owner to make sure that their property is protected in a way that makes it safer than a regular house with owner occupiers or permanent rentals? Or like, do we make that part of a policy for holiday rentals?
Comment on that, Annette?
Yes, please, Rod.
Yeah, so any of the tourism and ecotourism facilities are classified as special fire protection purpose developments. So under a document called Planning for Bushfire Protection. So if you're making modifications to one or building a new one, then they do have to meet a higher standard, and it's spelled out in that policy document. So those that don't go through that DA process I'm not sure how they're being captured, but certainly any change of use, any additions or alterations or any new proposals, they are built to a higher standard.
Okay, we might move on to Tonya. You there, Tonya?
I am. Sorry, I just had to find my unmute as well. From your perspective, it could either be Greg or Rod, Luke or Mike Gorman. Do the Greens cause bushfires? And if that's a furphy, what's the line that we give them back? Because so often I've been accused of causing the fires.
Rod, do you want to take that one first? But I'm sure someone else will want to weigh in as well.
Yeah, look, it's sad to see those sorts of comments. I mean, the polarised views on fires just emerge. That's somewhat crazy. But look, I'm not aware of green tape slowing up the implementation of prescribed burning to any significant extent. So there is need to consider the impacts on the environment when you undertake vegetation management or prescribed burning, etc. But that's quite possible to do that without too much difficulty. The other thing that sort of bugs me a bit is the bad name that trees have been given. And there's a lot of really good science now that trees are actually useful in the right circumstances to mitigate the bushfire threat to your house. So if you remove trees, and particularly if you clear them totally, you create a sharp edge if you're in a forest, and you'll get wind turbulence at that sharp edge. So, you know, on the lee side of the remaining trees at the forest edge, that turbulence damages the building, opens it up to burning debris attack. So you want to use trees to catch burning debris. You want to use trees to filter the wind. So yeah, it's disturbing to see asset protection zones, which have a great purpose, being put in such a detrimental way. It actually exacerbates the risk. So trees can slow bushfire spread. Trees on steep slopes below the house can be problematic. Steeps uphill from your house may not be at all. So it's not one size fits all.
Anyone else have any comments on that? Okay, Peter Winkler has his hand up again.
Look, I just want to, in support of the concept of officers visiting people, just one little thing that happened to us again in the Naringala Valley, which was in between New Year's Eve and January the 4th, which was another catastrophic day. We had two RFS guys, I don't know who they were, they turned up on dirt bikes and visited us, and they did exactly what's been described as what's needed. They said, how did you manage on New Year's Eve? Are you ready for January the 4th? And they said, turn on your pump. And they watched the water coming out of the pump. They sort of tested how much water was in the tank. We all thought they were going to order us out. But they said, you know, they asked us what we were going to do if January the 4th was terrible. And of course, we had it all wrong. They gave us much better advice. So that kind of personal contact from our prospective fire officers is going to make a huge difference to fire-prone communities.
Thanks, Peter. Carolyn has sent through a link. Carolyn?
I'll just send it through.
Sorry, no, I just put my hand up by mistake, but yeah, it was just a link. It's quite a good article about that whole issue.
Okay, if you all look at your chat screens, that should be on there for anyone who wants to have a look at it. Given that we're running over time, I'm just wondering whether we could get a couple of concluding comments from Rod, Amanda, any of the other firefighters who'd like to contribute anything. Sorry, immediately, but I think that's Terry who has his hand up. We'll squeeze you in first. David, sorry, not Terry. I've lost your name.
Yeah, thanks, Annette. With the recent introduction of the 25-metre rule, a number of the members of the Berry Land Care group that I work with in the Berry Bushlinks project are very concerned about that because it undermines the work we're trying to do to create corridors for wildlife. I wonder if Rod or any of the other fireys or people with experience, maybe Greg would like to comment about that.
Rod, Greg, who's...
Yeah, look, I'd certainly like to comment. I've made a submission on behalf of the Fire Protection Association. That's a group of all the bushfire consultants in New South Wales. We are quite concerned about the ad hoc nature of that type of clearing. Any strategic fire management should be, as the name suggests, strategically located. Property boundaries are not necessarily strategic in their placement. So if you remove trees there, you may not actually be improving the bushfire management much at all. Access may be another thing, but yeah, look, it's disappointing. Hopefully there'll be some refinement of that. But, it was in response to, one of the inquiries, but I think the response needs refinement, to say the least.
Greg, did you want to add to that, or?
Oh, no, I agree with Rod. I think it's pretty coarse exercise, really. I mean, we know that the so-called breaks, they're not breaks. Fire in these catastrophic events jump over, rivers, dam, water bodies and things like that. So it's a very coarse way of dealing with it. And again, this idea that once you do it, then you have to maintain it. So you think about the costs and time and money in terms of all this clearing. I think there was a suggestion at one stage that they clear along each side of the road reserve on major routes through the Shoalhaven, and I just don't see it as a realistic proposition. I think it's quite random, and we really need to think very carefully about where we need to do work and apply it there, rather than just having a blanket rule. It just seems to be an excuse to clear vegetation to me, rather than a fire one.
Okay, we might call it an end there. If Rod and Amanda would just like to make some very quick concluding comments on where they see this issue going. Guys, who wants to go first? Rod?
Yeah, look, I'll jump in. Not so much where this goes, but just a concluding comment. The most important place to work on your life and property protection is in your own backyard and on your own house. 90% of buildings are lost through burning debris attack. And that just means, a match, if you like, or a box of matches lighting on your front veranda. You can remove that risk with some good planning and good preparation. So, in the future, we need to have buildings that survive when you leave. So if you evacuate early, and the CSIRO have just, I read it this morning in Queensland, have got a new policy that they're looking to have buildings resilient without people in them. And of course, if you have to refuge in them, you're much better off having a building that will survive. So this is a step above some of the current development application standards, but that's the direction. There's plenty of new things emerging, but a lot of it sits in our court as owners of homes and properties. It starts there. That's where the best result is achieved.
Okay, we'll slot Casey in very quickly. I hope it's a short one, Casey.
Yeah, it is. 100% agree with Rod earlier about the 100 metres away from homes and all that kind of stuff. And I really like the idea of the bushfire consultants, especially to go around to houses, because of the fact that people do get RFS. We get tied up. We get tied up in day-to-day operations, issuing permits, fundraising, managing brigades, all that kind of stuff. But one of the things really that people also need to take on board is, if you're going to stay and fight your own property, make sure that you're fit and that you're capable of doing so. We visited so many people that were trying to protect their house that were absolutely physically buggered. They don't understand how demanding it is. I think it's a really important message to consider as we go forward, especially with this sort of stuff.
Thanks very much, Casey. Amanda, do you have a few remarks you'd like to finish with?
When you said to be brief, and that just made me smile and go, okay, how can I be brief at the end of this? Okay, well, what I am going to start with is that, look, I am excited that we can make this difference at council. you know, when Mike, and I can see him at the bottom of my screen, I don't know if anyone else can, you know, when I had that conversation with you, Mike, you know, I really wanted to do something about what you said. And I think that this is the way, you know, we haven't had any luck in convincing the state government to do anything about this. So why can't we do it here in the Shoalhaven? We've had, you know, groundbreaking and award-winning programs in so many other areas, that why can't we do this, and why can't we, you know, make it a priority? So that's why I want to do it, because I think that it is important for our future. The other thing that I think is really important for our future, a very political statement, but you know, we need to do what the Western Australian government have done, and that is to cease logging in our old growth forests that are here. And although that some people will say, oh, that'll cause more fires, well, actually it won't, because we know that the science is in on that, Rod, with the, you know, the fact that the older trees and the older established forests don't burn the same way that the younger forests do. And I really want to say to a massive thanks to all of our, and oh, there's Andrew Dix. Hello, Andrew Dix. You've had a pretty hard time out there at Manana too. So I want to acknowledge all of the hard times that everybody have had, and that the road to recovery is long, and that, you know, as we continue to go on that road to recovery together, that the best way we do it is collaboratively, and that, you know, working together, having these kind of conversations that feed into policy changes and to make things better for the future. Like David said, you know, council's offices could do this in the winter months or the summer months, then that's where we've got the best chance to thrive together. But the last bit is thank you to all of our fireys for getting on today and being part of the conversation. I really appreciate the work that you do every single day. I really, really hope that this summer is a little easier. I've got a wood table, I've got one hand on it, I'm touching the wood, and that we don't have to face what we did in 2019, 2020, that the fires that we have in the next few months are only going to be those that are a little bit lesser, because we know that we'll have them, but that we don't end up spending, you know, 74 days on a fire front. So that's, yeah, thanks heaps everyone. And thanks so much for giving up part of your Saturday to be part of this really important conversation.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Yeah, look, thank you to everyone for coming along. It's been a really constructive and useful discussion. If any of you would like to follow up any further with any of our experts or our politicians and candidates, probably the best way to do that is to go onto Facebook, find the link to this event and leave a comment or a request or message them directly using that. But thank you all for coming. It's been terrific. We might do it again.
Thank you. Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.